Okay, has everyone got the handouts? Yep, they made their way. We're not going to need them for the first 1 or 2 minutes, but we're going to use them quite intensively as the day goes on. And there are a number of complicated diagrams, so really what I want you to do is listen and annotate diagrams as opposed to just go through that mindless copying out. Our third topic is going to be moving into an area that the foundations should be something that you're familiar with, but the whole concept won't be. Now, as advertised on the reading list, the topic is to do with exchange, and it's how individuals undertake trade with one another. But in a more general context, this is going to introduce you to the idea, a way of thinking within economics, known as general equilibrium analysis. Now, you'll all be familiar with the concept, if not the name, of partial equilibrium. Everything that you've probably done up until this point in economics has been partial equilibrium. Now, partial equilibrium looks at individual markets or individual consumers and how these markets would clear. General equilibrium, though, looks across multiple consumers and multiple markets and looks how the interactions between these markets lead to markets clearing. So, what we're going to do, I'll just initially give you a very, very brief overview of what we're going to do in today's lecture. I'm going to introduce you to the basic ideas, the basic concepts of general equilibrium analysis. I'm not going to do this algebraically. I could do it algebraically, but it's not particularly interesting for me, and I'm sure it wouldn't be particularly interesting for you. So we're going to do it diagrammatically, which does restrict us somewhat in what we can do, and I'll tell you about that on the next slide. But we're going to look at this idea of general equilibrium analysis diagrammatically using something known as an Edgeworth box diagram. Now, when we've done that, once I've introduced you to the basic features of general equilibrium analysis, then we're going to bring in the idea of exchange, how individuals trade amongst themselves. And I'm going to give you 2 different allocation mechanisms. One is where individuals undertake a barter mechanism, where they exchange goods directly with one another. Then, once we've done that, and we've introduced ourselves to the basic idea of how exchange takes place and the implications of trade, then we're going to start bringing in markets and prices and how they clear markets and how they affect the trade that takes place, the exchange that takes place between individuals. And then lastly, the very last thing we'll do is I'll introduce you, given that we set the scene, to some basics of welfare economics, the basic theorems of welfare economics. And these will all be couched in terms of this general equilibrium analysis. So that's the basic overview of what we're going to do this and the next lecture. That's what we're going to do for this afternoon. So, I said that general equilibrium looked at multiple consumers and multiple markets. I also said that I want to treat this diagrammatically. I don't want to give you an algebraic interpretation. So, if we're going to be looking at diagrams, that constrains what we can do essentially. Because if we're going to look at things diagrammatically, we've got a flat piece of paper. So, that means we can't look at n number of goods and n number of consumers. So what we're going to do, to fit within this diagrammatic representation, I'm going to bring it down to the minimum number of consumers and markets, or goods and consumers, that we'll need. So we're going to restrict this down to an investigation of 2 goods and 2 consumers. Now, thinking about what you did in a partial equilibrium framework, when we looked at the theory of consumer choice. That looked at one consumer and two goods. Well, all we're going to do now is introduce one extra consumer and see how the interaction between these two consumers affects the clearing of markets. So two consumers and two goods. And given that we want to concentrate upon the exchange that takes place, how individuals trade with one another, we're going to look at what's referred to as a pure exchange model. That is, we are going to look at a system where individuals have endowments of these two goods. Now, we're not going to be concerned where these endowments come from. We're not concerned about production. That would be another topic for another day. We're only going to concentrate upon how exchange takes place. So individuals will have fixed endowments of goods in the same way, but when we looked at our concept, our theory of intertemporal choice last week, we said that our individual had a fixed endowment of income, a certain amount of income in the present and a certain amount of income in the future. Well, that's what we're going to do here. Our two consumers will have certain fixed endowments of these two goods. So we're not going to concern ourselves with how production takes place. It just complicates what we do. And then, as I alluded to only a few minutes ago, we'll initially look at a system, given these two goods and two consumers with a fixed endowments of these goods. Initially, we're going to run through the scenario where the individuals trade with one another via a barter system. That is, the individuals directly swap the goods with one another. There are no prices, there's no money. These individuals have endowments of the goods and they directly swap them with one another. It's a barter system. Now, once we've seen the basics of exchange and how these individuals exchange goods amongst themselves, then we'll introduce money, then we'll introduce prices. For the moment, though, purely a barter system. Now, this first diagram should be very, very familiar to you. Now, we've got two goods and two consumers. Now, our two goods that we're going to look at, we're not going to be adventurous. We're just going to call our two goods good X and good Y. And we're going to have two consumers. And we'll call our consumers person A and person B. Now, these are the indifference curves for person A. So if I said to you, represent please the indifference curves for person A, who chooses between two goods, good X and good Y, that is the sort of diagram you should all, or you would all be able to produce for me. We've got good Y on the vertical axis, we've got good X on the horizontal axis. And all we're doing is representing person A's preferences, tastes for these two goods with a conventional set of indifference curves. So this is something that we've done before, that you've done before, that you are all familiar with. And as we move, as you would know, as we move to higher and higher indifference curves, the welfare of person A increases. The welfare of person A increases. And he would much rather be on a higher indifference curve, for example that one there, than a lower indifference curve. So this is his origin, where he's got absolutely nothing. He's got no goods, units of good X, no units of good Y. And then as we move away, we're giving him more of good X and more of good Y. And this makes him better off. So that increasing welfare as we move to higher and higher indifference curves. And that is straightforward. It's something we've all seen before. Now what I want to do is introduce our second consumer. But I'm going to give you the exact same diagram. nothing is going to change. Well, actually, one thing is going to change. And that is the way that you look at the diagram. So rather than representing the preferences for person B in a diagram that looks like this, where we're representing it, if you can imagine, these are the axes, we're representing that way. I'm going to take that diagram and turn it around 180 degrees. Just completely turn it around. Therefore, that is exactly, for all intents and purposes, that is the exact same diagram for person B. We have good X measured on the horizontal axis. We have good Y measured on the vertical axis. And the indifference curves for person B, conventionally shaped, downward sloping from left to right. And as we move further and further away from person B's origin, his welfare increases. So he would much rather be on a higher indifference curve as opposed to a lower indifference curve. But that is exactly the same as everything else you've seen, and that is exactly the same as the previous diagram. So if you've got the notes in front of you, just get your notes and turn it around. And so that is, so if you don't believe me, that is the exact same diagram. So that's the starting point. We've got the indifference curves for person A. We've got the indifference curves for person B. And so far, you've got two separate diagrams. But I don't want to give you two separate diagrams. I want to give you one single diagram. So what we're going to do is take those two sets of indifference curves on the two separate diagrams and just bring them together. And we're going to bring them together into a single diagram. And that single diagram is going to be the first diagram. It's going to be the first diagram on the handout. Late arrivals, you've got the diagrams in front of you. Anyone not got the diagram? Put your hand up. We can see where to pass them to. Okay. This then is our first diagram. This is our Edgeworth box diagram. And all it does, it shows the preferences of these two consumers on one single diagram. So, for example, we had person A's origin down in the bottom left-hand corner. This is where person A has no units of good X and no units of good Y. And then as we move along horizontally, that's how we measured good X. As we moved up vertically, that's how we measured good Y. And then the indifference curves for person A are just these curved lines here. So UA is an example of just one indifference curve for person A. And I've drawn a few more. There's one there and one there. That's just a family of indifference curves. Now if I wanted to, I could draw a whole series of these, extending all the way from person A's origin, all the way to the top right-hand corner of the box. I've not put them in because it just makes it messy. We don't need to know about them at the moment. So that's person A, and person B was exactly the same. Person B's origin is here in the top right-hand corner. This is where person B has 0 units of good X and 0 units of good Y. So again, we're measuring good X horizontally. We're measuring good Y vertically. But remember, given that we're talking about person B, we're measuring all of these quantities to person B from his origin. So as we move along this top axis here, that is the quantity of good X increasing person B. As we move vertically down the axis here on the right, that's the quantity of good Y increasing for person B. So you've got two different consumers and two different origins. And the quantities for each consumer are measured relative to their own respective origin. But let's just bring in those two diagrams together that we saw before. So, given this box then, which is our Edgeworth box, our starting point in the diagram is E. That is the initial endowment point. Now, as we said, there are fixed endowments. Both consumers have fixed amounts of good X and good Y. So, for example, what this would mean is that person A, whose origin is in his bottom left-hand corner, person A has a certain amount of good X and a certain amount of good Y. How much of good X does he have? Well, if we measure from his origin, person A has X A amount of good X. Person A has Y A amount of good Y. So that's his fixed endowment. That's the amount of good X and good Y he starts with. So that's his endowment of both goods. And in the same way, person B has an endowment of these two goods. Measured from his origin, person B has XB amount of good X and YB amount of good Y. So we measure from his origin to the endowment point. That gives us the quantities of good X and good Y that he has. Now, given that I've said person A has a fixed amount of good X, person B has a fixed amount of good X, person A has XA, person B has XB. Now, what do XA and XB equal? Well, they equal the width of the Edgeworth box. Now, the width of the Edgeworth box measures good X, or the total availability of good X within the economy. And in the same way, the height of the Edgeworth box represents the total availability of good Y in the economy. And what determines the total availability of good Y? How much of good Y person A has, how much of good Y person B has. And so, this Edgeworth box, even though it might have appeared that we've just drawn randomly as just any old box, it's drawn to very, very specific dimensions. The dimensions will represent the total availability of the goods within the economy. So the width is how much of good X is available. The height is how much of good Y is available. And it doesn't matter how much of X, how much of Y, or indeed where the initial endowment point is. These two identities here will always be true. That is, the total availability of good X, which I've called X bar, is equal to the amount of good X that person A has and the amount of good X person B has. And in the same way, the height of the Edgeworth box, which I've denoted as Y bar, is equal to the amount of good Y that person A has plus the amount of Y that person B has. As a point, just to avoid confusion, now I know if you do stats or econometrics, sometimes we use a bar to denote an average or a mean value. I've put bars on here. X bar here doesn't mean the average of X or the mean of X. I've put the bar to denote the fact that X is fixed. In microeconomics, a bar is often used to denote something that's fixed. So what we're saying here is the width of the Edgeworth box, the total availability of good X, is fixed. It's fixed and determined by the endowments of good X from our two consumers. And exactly the same for person Y. Sorry, for person B, and hence the availability of good Y. Note though, even though these consumers have differing endowments of the goods, there is only one endowment point for the economy. If you ever draw these boxes, don't do anything in an exam such that you've got 2 endowment points, it's completely wrong. There can only ever be 1 endowment point. And there you go, that is it. That is the endowment point that we have. So that's setting up the initial idea of the Edgeworth box. Now, what we want to do is introduce this idea of exchange or trade. That both consumers have their initial endowments, certain amount of good X, certain amount of good Y. The question is, are the 2 consumers happy to remain at point T with their initial endowments, or would they find it beneficial to exchange these goods with one another, to get involved in some sort of trade? Well, the way in which we answer that question, then the next part of the diagram, is by drawing the indifference curves, person A and person B, that pass through the initial endowment point. So, for example, the indifference curve for person A that represents his preferences, his tastes between good X and good Y, that passes through the initial endowment point, would be that indifference curve UA. The indifference curve for person B that passes through the initial endowment point is that indifference curve UB. So now we ask our question. Is there a possibility that these 2 individuals could undertake some sort of swap, some sort of trade with one another? Well, they only wish to do that, this is the important part here, if there are mutually beneficial exchanges to be had. Person A might say to person B, I would like all of your goods, please, and I'm going to give you nothing. Well, that would work wonderfully well for person A, but it wouldn't work for person B. So person B wouldn't be willing to undertake that exchange. So you can see there's got to be something in it for both parties. They've got to identify a trade and exchange, the ability to swap these goods amongst themselves that benefits them both. If it doesn't benefit them both, they're both not going to be willing to exchange. So it's got to be mutually beneficial. Well, given what we've said with the indifference curves, UA for person A, UB for person B, what do these individuals want to do? They want to maximise their well-being. They want to be on the highest possible indifference curve. So let's take person A as an example. Person A is currently at point E, the initial endowment, and point E lies on that indifference curve, UA. So if we said to person A, would you be willing to move to an alternative bundle? And person A would say, well, I would, if I can reach a higher indifference curve. So person A would be more than willing to move from that initial endowment point if he could move into this sort of area here. Move onto an indifference curve that's higher than his current one, UA. So any movement into this area here for person A makes him better off. So he'd be willing to do that. Now in the same way, person B would be willing to undertake an exchange if it moved him onto a more preferred indifference curve. Well, this is person B's indifference curve, and his welfare increases as he moves downwards and to the left away from his origin. So that's his origin. If he moves from UB to any indifference curve in this sort of area, he's better off. So what have we identified here? Well, we've identified the fact that there's scope for mutually advantageous trade to take place. So if person A wants to move into that area there, above and to the right of UA, person B wants to move into that sort of area there, below and to the left of UB. That area that I've shaded there is that area of mutual advantage. Either of these consumers move from point E into anywhere within that shaded area, they would both be moving onto a higher indifference curve. They would both be better off. And therefore, that is a trade that they wish to undertake. When, for example, this is purely as an example, let's say point M. Now we could easily imagine our two consumers moving from point E to point M. If they did that, person A would be on a higher indifference curve. The indifference curve that passes through point M, you can see, is higher for person A. Likewise, the indifference curve for person B that passes through point M is also higher. So they'd both be better off. And if you look at what point M means, at point M, person A has a little bit more X and a little bit less Y. And vice versa for person B. So what's happened? Person A has exchanged a little bit of his good Y for some of person B's good X. They've undertaken a swap with one another, and it's allowed them, by moving from E to M, it's allowed them both to reach a higher indifference curve. They are both better off. Therefore, they would undertake that exchange. And they would undertake the exchange to make themselves better off. So now, for the next question. Would they be happy to remain at point M? Well, they would, unless there were more mutually advantageous trades that could take place. So what we would do is, again, we'd draw the indifference curves for our two consumers that pass through point M. And do they create an area of mutual advantage like that? Do the indifference curves cross? Is there an area that both individuals can move into? If there is, they would wish to undertake even more trade. And they would continue to trade until all of those mutually advantageous opportunities have been exploited. So this would continue. We go, second diagram now. This would continue until we arrive at a situation that looks like this. So, we started off at point E. And we said whenever the indifference curves cross one another, it creates an area of mutual advantage into which the individuals will move. That they will swap the goods, they will barter the goods between themselves, and they will keep on doing this until there are no further opportunities for mutually advantageous swaps. Well, by definition then, this will mean that we arrive at a point such as M, where the indifference curves for the two individuals just touch one another, where they are tangential. Now, as a point of clarification, when I gave you our revision last week, was it last week, maybe the week before, and we talked about the theory of consumer choice. And I said the one thing that you should always remember, what kind of indifference curves do? They can't cross. When we talk about this diagram here, and the indifference curves crossing, that's not the same thing. When we say that indifference curves cannot cross, we mean an individual's indifference curves cannot cross. What we're talking about here is two different sets of indifference curves. One for person A and one for person B. When they cross, it creates an area of mutually advantageous trade. And this will continue until we arrive at a point such as M. And at point M, there is no further scope for these individuals to trade with one another. There's no further incentive for these individuals to trade with one another. So if you look at point M, that line there is the indifference curve for person A, passes through point M. That line there is the indifference curve for person B that passes through point M. And ask yourself the question, where from point M does person A want to move to make himself better off? Well, he wants to move from point M above and to the right. He wants to move into this area here, onto a higher indifference curve. Person B, to make himself better off, wants to move from point M into this area, below and to the left of point M. So he moves on to a higher indifference curve also. So where person A wants to move, that area, where person B wants to move, that area, there's no overlap. There's now no longer any scope for mutually advantageous swaps. If, for example, we move from point M to a point there, where I'm just indicating there, would person A be happy to do that? Of course he would. He would be better off. But person B isn't going to go from point M to a point such as that, because he would move on to a lower indifference curve. He's not going to give up something purely for the benefit of the other. Hence, point M is that point where all mutually advantageous trade has been exhausted. And point M is a very, very specific point, not just within general equilibrium, but also more generally within this idea of economics. Because point M is what is described as a Pareto efficient or a Pareto optimal point. That point there, it's Pareto efficient. Now, the idea of Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality is a crucial concept, aspect in economics. But there are a number of different ways in which we can precisely define it. And I want to give you two such definitions. Now, even though the wording of these is going to be different, what they allude to, what they mean, and the implications are still exactly the same. So I'll tell you what these definitions, or two potential definitions of Pareto efficiency are, and then I'll go back to the diagram and show you how and why point M is indeed Pareto efficient. So, our first definition that we can use is that a Pareto efficient allocation occurs when there is no way to make some individual better off without making someone else worse off. So if we have a Pareto efficient or Pareto optimal outcome, the only way you can make someone better off is at the expense of someone else. So that's our first one. Only make someone better off by making someone else worse off. That's our first definition, or first precise wording of Pareto efficiency. Our second wording is that a Pareto efficient allocation occurs when all gains from trade have been exhausted. Now, whilst those are indeed completely different wordings, and you might think that they allude to different concepts, they are both exactly the same. And when we look at point M in the previous diagram, you'll see how point M accords with both of those wordings there. So it doesn't mean there are two different ways to measure Pareto efficiency. Pareto efficiency is Pareto efficiency. It never changes. There are just subtly different ways in which we can describe it. So, occurs when there is no way to make someone better off without making someone else worse off, and occurs when all gains from trade have been exhausted. So, everyone finished copying those down? Yep. Okay, back to the diagram then. So, why is point M Pareto efficient? Well, let's look at our first definition. The only way to make someone better off is if you make someone else worse off. How can we make person A better off? By moving, as we described previously, by moving above or to the right of point M. That's the only way that person A can be made better off, by moving on to a higher indifference curve. But as soon as we move above or to the right of point M, it automatically puts person B onto a lower indifference curve. In this area here, person B would be on a lower indifference curve. So we can't make person A better off without making person B worse. Exactly the same for person B. He can be made better off if we move to the left or below point M. That's what moves him onto a more preferred indifference curve. But if we do that to person B, what happens to person A? He would move on to a lower indifference curve. So, whatever happens, if we move from point M, only way we can make one of them better off is at the expense of the other. Hence, point M is Pareto efficient. That was our first wording. Now, the second wording was that Pareto efficient allocation occurs when all gains from trade have been exhausted. Have they been exhausted? We said the indifference curves are tangential. It was only when the indifference curves crossed that we created that area of mutual advantage, where individuals could gain by trading. Because the indifference curves at point M don't cross, there are no gains to be had from trade. Hence, point M, again, is Pareto efficient. Now, given what I've said then, and given the definitions that we illustrated previously, what does that suggest about any Pareto efficient point? Any Pareto efficient point must be characterised, as we have here, must be characterised by a tangency of the indifference curves. That's our definition. There are no further gains to be had from trade. So the indifference curves must be tangential. At any point, therefore, where the indifference curves are tangential, will be a Pareto efficient point. And in this diagram here, our Edgeworth box diagram, if we connected up, or we traced out all of those points where the respective sets of indifference curves were tangential, and by definition are Pareto efficient points, and we connected all of these points up, we would trace out this line that runs more or less, as I've drawn it, through the middle of the Edgeworth box. That line is known as the efficiency locus, or the contract curve. And the contract curve will trace out all of these Pareto efficient points, where there is a tangency between the respective set of indifference curves. So, that was that diagram there. Now, pulling all of this together, what does it suggest about the contract curve? We've said that actually, before I do that, one final point about the contract curve. You've seen I've drawn it there, and typically that will be the shape of the contract curve. Typically, it will run from one person's origin to another, to the other person's origin. Doesn't have to be a straight line, doesn't have to be regular, but typically it will run from one corner of the Edgeworth box to another. And that will trace out all of those Pareto efficient points. So, for example, if we took that point there in person A's origin, what does that mean about the allocation of resources? If the economy was exactly there in person A's origin, what does person A have? absolutely nothing. Person A has no good X and no good Y. What does person B have? Person B would have absolutely everything. All of good X that's available, all of good Y that's available. That belongs to person B. But because that point in person A's origin lies on the contract curve, it is Pareto efficient. Oh, does that seem sensible? How can it be Pareto efficient where person A has absolutely nothing and person B has everything? Well, forget about the welfare judgments about whether it's right that person B has everything. In terms of Pareto, it is an efficient point. Because how could we make person A better off? By giving him something. It doesn't matter. If we give person A something, it will make him better off. But if we're going to give person A something, where do we get that something from? We get it from person B. And if we take it away from person B, it makes person B worse off. So even though that point in person A's origin is blatantly unfair, it is still, nonetheless, a Pareto efficient point. The only way we can make person A better off is by making person B worse off. Hence, that accords with our definition of what a Pareto efficient point is. And in exactly the same interpretation would apply to every single point on that contract curve. So, pulling together this discussion of what the contract curve is. We've said that starting absolutely anywhere in that Edgeworth box, consumers will trade with one another. And they will continue to trade with one another until all mutually advantageous benefits, gains from trade have been exhausted. And what describes those points where all mutually beneficial exchanges have been exhausted? That describes the contract curve. And hence, I've introduced you to the idea of the efficiency locus, or contract curve, but there's also another interpretation I want you to put on it. Because it doesn't matter where the initial endowment is, we can guarantee, regardless of where that endowment point is, individuals will trade with each other, they will exploit any gains from trade until they eventually arrive somewhere on the contract curve. Because if they're not on the contract curve, it's not Pareto efficient. If it isn't Pareto efficient, there are still gains to be had through trading. And so, individuals will continue to trade until they arrive at some point on the contract curve. And that point where they end up, I'll introduce this very, very quickly. That point where they end up, regardless of where they start from, is contained in that diagram there on the bottom of the handout. If we bring together that last diagram that we saw and the very first diagram that we saw with the Edgeworth box, essentially that is what we end up with. And this is showing now the idea of that principle of the contract. So that was our Edgeworth box, where the height of it reflects the total availability of Y, the width of it reflects the total availability of good X. That's person A's origin, that person's B origin. Point E is our initial endowment point, given our fixed endowments of the goods to the two consumers. That UA is the initial indifference curve for person A. That UB is the initial indifference curve for person B. Now, because these two indifference curves crossed, it means that there was an area of mutual benefit that they could move into. That area bounded between the respective sets of indifference curves. And so our two consumers move into there, and they will continue to move within that area until they arrive at a Pareto efficient point. One of those points where all of the mutually advantageous benefits from trade have been exhausted. Well, we've said that that locus describing those mutually advantageous trades is the contract curve. So if we start at point E, we can guarantee we know where we're going to finish up. More or less, we know where we're going to finish up. Individuals will trade their way into this area until they arrive at some point on the contract curve between points A and B. However, what we can't say, and this is what I just alluded to previously, what we can't say is precisely where they'll be. I mean, we previously said point M, but point M is merely an example of where they could finish up. More specifically, will be anywhere on the contract curve between point A and B. And where we finish up, the exact point that we finish up will depend upon the relative bargaining strengths of the two parties. So what have we said for the moment? We've said that the way in which exchange takes place between our two consumers is via a bartering system, where they directly swap the goods with one another. It's up for our two consumers, A and B, to determine the terms of trade. How much of good X do you swap for good Y? What are going to be these relative magnitudes? Well, that's for our two consumers to strike up the bargain for themselves. Now, when person A is the better bargainer, when person A has more strength in this bargaining process, what it will mean is where we eventually end up on the contract curve is going to be closer to this point here, point B. See, as we move closer and closer to point B, it means person A is moving to higher and higher indifference curves. That person A is getting more out of this bargain than person B, until indeed we arrive at point B. If you look at the way I've described point B, person B is still on the exact same indifference curve. Still on indifference curve UB. It's person A who's on a higher indifference curve. So if this were the bargain, person B actually doesn't get anything out of it. Person B is no worse off, but actually he's no better off. So this for person B is the absolute margin. Person A, though, has managed to exploit all potential gains here. So, if person A were the stronger or the better bargainer, we're more likely to be at a point closer to point B. If, in contrast, though, person B were the better bargainer, well, we would then end up at a point closer to point A. And again, point A is the absolute margin of where trade can take place. So if we look at point A here, person A is still on the exact same indifference curve UA. So we've not made person A worse off, but we've not made him better off either. But that's the absolute margin of his ability and willingness to trade. Person B, though, has moved from his indifference curve, UB, I'm just tracing out there, to that indifference curve that lies on point A. So in that scenario, person B has gained all the potential benefits from trade. And it depends on who is the stronger bargainer, where exactly along that contract curve will be. So all we can say is that we will arrive at a Pareto efficient point. We will arrive at a point on the contract curve. Where exactly on the contract curve, we can't say for sure. It depends upon the bargaining strengths of the two parties. Now, I said that I was going to show you two different allocation mechanisms. One, where these individuals bargain directly with one another. That's what we've shown here. We've introduced you to the idea of the Edgeworth box, introduced you to the idea of Pareto efficiency and the contract curve. The one disadvantage of this barter system is it doesn't lead to a precise outcome. Contrast that, though, with what I'm now going to show you. And this is the allocation system where we rely upon markets, where we rely upon prices to set the terms of trade. When you pop out to do your shopping, if you pop across the road to Tesco's, you don't go there, you don't pick up your shopping and then try and bargain with the person on the till how much you're going to pay. You say, well, okay, that's the price I'm going to pay. Hence, in a market economy, that's what we do. We rely upon prices, and we rely upon prices not only set the terms of trade, but also rely upon prices to clear markets. That was Adam Smith's invisible hand. So now, that's what we're going to do. This alternative allocation mechanism where we rely upon competitive markets. Free markets where prices can adjust to clear those markets. So, this then is the diagram on the other side of the handout. And what we've got here is not too different from what we saw before. We've got that same basic setup of the Edgeworth box. We've got that same initial endowment point. We've got our same two consumers, our same two goods, X and Y. Now, though, we've introduced prices. So what I've done here is only one extra line, and that is that straight line there that passes through the initial endowment point. And that straight line is the budget constraint. That budget constraint that you've seen before. And all that a budget constraint does, it shows the rate at which consumers are able to trade one good for another. In this diagram, what rate can the consumer exchange good X for good Y? That's determined by our budget constraint. So that straight line there that passes through the endowment point, if it's a budget constraint, its slope will, as we've seen before, reflect the relative prices of the two goods. More precisely, it's minus the price of the good on the horizontal axis divided by the price of the good on the vertical axis. So it's minus price of X over price of Y. Now what we've done for the moment, what I've done for the moment, is assume an arbitrary set of prices. Any old price of X, price of Y, we've taken those. And with those arbitrary set of prices, that would determine the budget constraint. And in particular, it would determine the slope of the budget constraint. And now all we're going to do is use those conventional tools of consumer theory that you've seen in the past. So we've got person A and person B. Person A has a budget constraint. What does he want to do? He wants to be on his highest possible indifference curve, subject to that budget constraint. So, at person A's origin, that is the budget constraint that he faces. Given these sets of relative prices between good X and good Y, the highest possible indifference curve person A can reach is that indifference curve there, UA prime. And it just touches the budget constraint at that point there, TA. So given these set of relative prices, person A would wish to consume that much of good X, and he would wish to consume that much of good Y. And that's it. And that's no different from anything you've seen in the past. And it's exactly the same for person B. Person B faces that budget constraint there. Given the budget constraint, what does he want to do? Be on the highest possible indifference curve, subject to that budget constraint. Well, his highest possible indifference curve is that indifference curve, UB prime. Now, it could be on a low indifference curve down here, person B, but Why wouldn't he be here? Because that's not the highest possible indifference curve. The one he can reach that just touches the budget constraint is that indifference curve there, UB prime. And it just touches the budget constraint at point TB. And again, that defines a certain amount of good X and a certain amount of good Y at these current prices that person B wishes to consume. However, there's a problem. And the problem is person A and person B don't want to be at the same point. And if person A and person B don't want to be at the same point, you can see person A wants to be there, person B wants to be there. So whenever they wish to be at different points, there will be disequilibrium. And things will change. And this is why they'll change. And in order to appreciate why they change, I just want you to think about demand and supply in both markets for X and Y. So we'll start off by looking at good X. Now remember, what did the width of the Edgeworth box represent? We said it was the total availability of good X. We're measuring good X horizontally. So the width of that box determines the total availability. How much of a supply there is of good X. So that's how much consumers can consume. So that's the supply of good X. Well, how much of good X is demanded within this economy? Well, at the current prices of PX and PY, our arbitrary set of prices, person A, we said, wishes to be at point TA. Consuming, that red line there, denotes that's the amount of good X that he wishes to consume. That's person A's origin, and that's where he wants to consume. So that red line there, the length of the red line, denotes person A's demand for good X. Now in the same way, there's also a demand from good X coming from person B. Now person B's origin, remember, is here. And he doesn't wish to be in his origin, he wishes to be all the way here at point TB. So his demand for good X, how much of good X he wishes to consume, is that distance from his origin all the way to there. That's the length of that red line. So that's his demand for good X. So person A demands that much of good X. Person B demands that much of good X. Now the way that I've drawn those two red lines, what's obvious? Those two lines overlap each other. The total sum of demand in the economy is greater at these current prices. The amount of good X person A and person B collectively want to demand is greater than the supply. And the extent of the excess supply is how much these two lines overlap. And it's that distance there in the diagram between Z and TA. So there's excess demand for good X. The width is the total supply. The length of these two lines, 1, 2, is the demand. So there's more demand than supply. There's excess demand for good X. And just to throw something at you, if there's excess demand for a good, what will happen to its price? It will increase. The price is going to change. Exactly. So that was good X. Now what about good Y? Well, it's fairly similar in that there is going to be a mismatch between the demand and supply of good Y. Now remember, good Y measured vertically, and the height of the Edgeworth box represents the total availability of good Y, or how much supply there is of good Y. Well, how much of good Y does person A want? Person A wants to be at point TA, so he's demanding that red line there, that distance, that's the amount of good Y he wants at the current price. Person B measure on his origin, wants to be at point T, B. So that is the amount of good Y that he wishes to demand. And if you add up that red line and that red line, you can see they don't sum to the total availability. So that area there, between Z and TB, represents the excess of supply over demand. And hence, there is an excess supply of good Y. So we can see both markets are in disequilibrium. There is an excess demand for good X, which causes its price to increase. There's an excess supply of good Y. And if there's excess supply of good, its price will come down. So, given that then, I'll ask you that very simple question. What's going to happen to that budget constraint? Will it increase or decrease? Will the slope of that budget constraint increase or decrease? In both markets. If there's excess demand for good X, excess demand forces its price up. So Adam Smith, market's clearing, prices go up. So there you go, the price of X will increase. If there's excess supply of good Y, its price will fall. That's how markets clear. If there's excess supply, it drops. Well, what do you remember about the slope of the indifference curve? It's equal to minus, because it's a negative slope, slopes downwards from left to right, but then it's the relative prices of the two goods. Price of X over price of Y. Well, if we've said that the price of X will increase, that number on the top is going to get bigger. Price of Y will decrease, the number on the bottom will get smaller. Both of those do the same thing. It's a bigger number on the top, it increases. A smaller number on the bottom, it increases. So both of those factors move in the same direction. They will mean that the slope of the budget constraint will increase. And so, if the slope of the budget constraint increases, it's going to become steeper. From where then? It becomes steeper. Does it mean it pivots? That's a steeper line. That could be. Or maybe is it pivoting that way? Or potentially, is it something else? What have we got in this diagram? In the same way as we saw with intertemporal choice, we have an endowment point. And what do we say about an endowment point? It should always be available. If consumers don't wish to trade away from endowment point, that should always be an option for them. So the budget constraint, don't think you draw a budget constraint and then put the endowment point on it. The better way of thinking about it is you have an endowment point, and then to the left, to the right of that endowment point, then you draw the budget constraint. Because what will happen here, if the price of X increases, if the price of Y decreases, so this relative ratio changes, the budget constraint becomes steeper, but it pivots about that initial endowment point. And so, that is what would happen. That is what happens, that's what's caused by these excess conditions of demand and supply in the two markets. The relative prices change. And now what will the consumers do? The consumers will aim to be on the highest possible indifference curve, subject to that new budget constraint. And they will continue to move around until the demand and supply conditions in both markets are equalised. Now, the diagram that we've got here, we said there was a problem because our two consumers wish to be at different points. And when they're at different points, there are excess demand or excess supply conditions. So, whenever the consumers wish to be at different points, there will be excess demand and excess supply. And whenever that happens, prices will continue to adjust. And so we can't be in equilibrium. And so, that's what's going to happen here. We will arrive in equilibrium when we will arrive in an equilibrium when prices have adjusted such that they've cleared both markets. So there's no longer any excess demand or excess supply in either of these markets. And that will look, next diagram, that will look like that. Where now the prices have adjusted. If you compare that line there, that budget constraint with the previous one, it's steeper. And given that budget constraint, consumer A, the highest possible indifference curve that he can reach is that indifference curve there, UA, which is tangent to the budget constraint at point W. Consumer B, the highest possible indifference curve that he can reach is indifference curve UB. And similarly, that is also tangent to the budget constraint at point W. And the set of prices are now PX star and PY star. These are our equilibrium prices. These are the prices that clear the markets. Both consumers now wish to be at point W. And if they're both at point W, there's no excess demand, there's no excess supply. The demand for good X exactly equals the supply of good X. So what's going to happen to its price? Nothing. The demand for good Y exactly equals the supply of good Y. And again, nothing will happen to its price. Hence, these prices that now give us this new, steeper budget constraint are our equilibrium set of prices. So that is how the market will clear. And that is how prices adjust to clear markets. But what do we notice about that point W? What do we notice about that point where markets have been allowed to be cleared by the price level? That the outcome, the equilibrium point that we get at W, means that both indifference curves are tangent not just to that budget constraint, but they're also tangent to each other. So, all I've said here, marginal rate of substitution, which is the slope of our indifference curves, are equal to the marginal rate of transformation. Now, that's just another way of saying the relative prices of the two goods, the slope of the budget constraint. The marginal rate of transformation is merely the rate at which the market allows one good to be transformed into another. And what determines that rate? Well, their relative prices. So what we've described here are competitive equilibrium, when this describes markets where prices adjust to clear those markets, and there are no inhibitions and no hindrances upon these price movements. That's our competitive market. That is the outcome that's guaranteed. What do we notice about that outcome? That the two sets of indifference curves are tangential, that they just touch one another. And we've already done something today that described exactly that. When indifference curves, when the respective set of indifference curves from the two consumers are tangential, it means we have a Pareto efficient outcome. And so what we find in this diagram here is what's known as the first theorem of welfare economics. And that is any competitive equilibrium, that is an equilibrium that's arrived at by the power of competition through competitive forces. Any competitive equilibrium is guaranteed to be Pareto efficient. That's the first theorem of welfare economics. Free and flexible markets, if you allow prices to clear these markets, the outcome that you get absolutely is guaranteed to be Pareto efficient. Now, I don't often get the opportunity to put big global quotes in this course, but very, very simply, going back to the late 1980s and through to the early 1990s, with all of discord in Russia. And Mikhail Gorbachev, what's known as the 500 Days Plan. This was the way of transforming the Russian economy. And what he said, one of the quotes in that manifesto there, is mankind has not succeeded in creating anything more efficient than a market economy. These were the blueprint that was put in place to transform the old Soviet planned economy. That move, that transition through privatization, through opening up markets, through introducing the power of competition and capitalism into the ex-Soviet Union. This is the whole thing about it. If you want to get efficiency in markets, and the way that we've described them is in terms of Pareto efficiency, you can absolutely guarantee that by having competitive markets. That is the first theorem of welfare economics. Any competitive outcome is Pareto efficient. What that previous diagram also allows us to do, though, what that diagram, last one there, also allows us to do, though, is identify precisely where the equilibrium is going to occur. Now, for all intents and purposes, exclude the budget constraint there, exclude that straight line. If we did that, that diagram looks just like the one where we describe the outcome of bartering. And we said that the eventual outcome would lie somewhere on the contract curve between points A and B, and that would be determined by the relative bargaining strengths of the parties. Now, though, it isn't our consumers who determine the terms of trade, it's prices. That determines how much of good X can be exchanged for how much of good Y. So, if that's our initial endowment point at E, we have our equilibrium set of prices. That determines the slope of the budget constraint, and therefore that competitive outcome is Pareto efficient. That Pareto efficient point then must lie on the contract curve. And so what this reliance upon markets and prices allows us to do is define exactly where the outcome is. Previously, we said it would be anywhere between A and B. Now, though, with prices, the outcome of this economy will be at point W. We've started at point E. Consumers, A and B, use prices, bargain with one another, or they trade with one another, and the eventual outcome is at point W. Is person A better off? Is person A better off? Yes or no? Yeah? If you look, the difference curve UA at point W, person A is on a higher indifference curve. He's better off. Is person B better off? Well, again, the answer is yes. Person B started on indifference curve UB. He finishes on that higher indifference curve there. So both individuals are better off. And of course, they must be better off because they move into that area there that's described as our Pareto improving set. We've made both people better off without making either of them worse off. So we've made our Pareto improvement, and we eventually end up at point W. Okay, now we've done the first theorem of welfare economics. To finish off this introduction to welfare, I now want to teach you or describe the second theorem of welfare economics. Just to give you a definition initially. The second theorem of welfare economics says that any Pareto efficient equilibrium can be obtained by competition, given an appropriate endowment. That's the second theorem of welfare economics. So, using the diagram that we've got already. What would the second theorem say? Well, if we started off at point E, now let's say that the economies decided, or the government decided that it would like the economy to be at point W. Now, if you look at point W, the nice thing about point W, it's sort of in the middle of the diagram. So it means that person A and person B have more or less the same amount of these two goods. So we might think, well, it's a pretty well-balanced society. There's not a huge amount of inefficiency. So let's say the government controls this economy and it determines that point W is a desirable outcome. That's where the government would like the economy to be, where there's not a huge amount of inequality between the consumers. Well, what does the second theorem of welfare economics say? It says that if the government wants the economy to be at point W, that will be fine. You can rely upon market forces to achieve this if the initial endowment is at point E, or indeed if the initial endowment is anywhere along that budget constraint. So if our initial endowment was anywhere along that budget constraint, competitive forces would do what? It would lead to a Pareto efficient outcome, and that would guarantee to be at point W. That's sort of what the second theorem of welfare economics says. Because there's a little bit of an issue. I think this is probably the first diagram I'm going to ask you to copy down for today. What would happen though if the initial endowment of the economy isn't consistent with the desired outcome? So let's go back to this diagram here. We'll say that the government wants to be at point W, where there's not too much inequality between our consumers. Well, starting from E, or anywhere along that budget constraint B1, rely upon market forces, absolutely, we are guaranteed to arrive at our desired point. So that wouldn't be a problem. But let's say, just say, that the initial endowment of the economy wasn't at point E, but rather it's at point E prime. So that's the initial endowment of goods between person A and person B. Now, what will relying on market forces do? Consumers will choose where they want to be at prevailing prices, markets will clear, prices will clear the market, will arrive at a Pareto efficient point, and in this diagram, that will be V. So if we start at E prime, competitive forces will guarantee a Pareto efficient outcome, but that Pareto efficient outcome is at V. And that's the problem. That is not the government's preferred point. The government wants to be at W. So what does it do? Well, the way that the government could get around this is if it takes the initial endowment at point E prime and changes it to the endowment at point E. It reorganises the goods between the two consumers, and it moves the economy from E prime to E, and then it relies upon competitive forces. Or indeed, it doesn't have to be to E, it could be anywhere along that budget constraint B1. And then, if the government does that, if it shifts the initial endowment point, then competitive forces will mean that we arrive at our desired point. Now, does that sound sensible? Or is there a flaw in that logic? Well, that's what the second theorem says. That we can achieve any desired outcome that we like, and in our diagram here, it's W. It just might be necessary, though, to change the initial endowment first. That's what the second theorem of welfare economics says. But surely, someone can see a fault in my logic here, the way that I'm describing this. Or maybe not. I convinced you all. we've said that that's our endowment E prime. And it's not consistent with our desired outcome at W. So what we do is we just shift E prime to E, and then we rely upon market forces. This is the strange part. Well, if we're going to shift the endowment from E prime to E, why don't we just shift it? Why doesn't the government just shift it directly from E prime to W? And it gets its desired outcome. Wouldn't that be the more plausible outcome? So what is this second theorem really getting at? Well, in this two-good setup, which is sort of good X and good Y, it's easy enough to think about reallocating the goods. But let's think what happens in a real-world economy. Are there just two goods? There are hundreds of thousands, there are millions of goods that consumers will have in their endowments. And it's wholly impossible for governments to influence all of them. But there's one thing that governments can influence very regularly, and that is income. Governments can influence consumers' endowments of income via the taxation and benefit system. And this is really what the second theorem of welfare economics is about, and how it works in practice. Yes, we might rely upon market forces to lead us to a desired outcome, but the way in which governments need to get involved intrinsically revolve around consumers' initial endowments of income, and governments can influence those. So this is what the second theorem is pointing to. If governments can influence consumers' endowments of money income through, for example, benefits and a taxation system, then economies can rely upon market forces to move us to outcomes that are consistent with economic and political ideals. Okay, everyone happy with that? Yeah? Okay, very quickly I'll skip on. I was going to say something about the assignment, I'll leave that till next week. Okay, very quickly, because I'm mindful that a lot of you said you want to leave by 1:45, I just want to revisit this idea of Pareto efficiency. And it's just because of the language that we use. Now we've described, for example, in this diagram here, we've got a contract curve, and that is the locus of all. That is the locus. Even though I said this is the last stop, I absolutely expect you to copy this down and understand it. It's not just a throwaway thing. This is what we've seen before. That contract curve is the locus of Pareto efficient points. Now, if we're not on the contract curve, it means we're at a Pareto inefficient point. Now, if I were to say to you, you don't know too much about economics, but if you're going to go from an inefficient point to an efficient point, it would represent some sort of improvement. You've gone for something that's inefficient, something that's efficient. Surely would represent improvement. When we look at Pareto, though, that's not always the case. I'll explain why. Briefly, I'll explain why. Let's say we've got point A. Point A is where the two indifference curves, sets of indifference curves cross. So it's Pareto inefficient. If we move anywhere from point A into the Pareto improvement set, we'll make both consumers better off. We'll make consumer A and consumer B better off. They can both move to higher indifference groups. So, for example, if we move from point A to point B, person A is no better off, but person B would be better off. Person B would be on a higher indifference group. So that is a Pareto improvement. We've made someone better off without making someone else worse. A Pareto improvement. If we looked at point A and D, exactly the same. We'd make person A better off, a higher indifference curve, without making person B worse off. He's on the same indifference curve. So again, it's a Pareto improvement. We're going from an inefficient point to an efficient point. And in exactly the same way, if we went from point A to point C, or indeed point A to point G, we are making both people better off. That is a Pareto improvement. However, what I now want you to do, though, is compare point A, for example, with point F. We're going from a Pareto inefficient point off the contract curve to a Pareto efficient point on the contract curve. This, though, doesn't represent an improvement. It's not a Pareto improvement. The reason is, if we go from point A to point F, is person B better off? Yes, person B would be on a higher difference curve. He starts off on UB, and he ends up on an even higher difference curve. For him, it's great. Person A, though, going from point A to point F, must be on a lower indifference curve. So the only way that we've made person B better off is at the expense of person A. So that does not represent an improvement in a Pareto sense. This whole idea of Pareto efficiency and Pareto optimality is it avoids interpersonal comparisons of welfare. Who are we to say it's right and just to improve one person's lot at the expense of someone else? In that sense, then, A, F, and indeed point E, they are all described as Pareto non-comparable.